Hello, and welcome back to Void Whispers. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from. I love reading every single one. If you enjoy the Void Whispers that creep in during the dead of night, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now, get comfortable, dim the lights if you dare, relax your mind, let the outside world fade away. And let's begin. Story 1, The Bronze, poured from the crucible in a stream of white gold fire. The roar of the furnace swallowed every other sound in the foundry, until even the men shouting orders seemed to move without voices. Heat pressed against their faces like an open hand. Sparks rose into the dark roof beams, and smoke gathered beneath the rafters. The apprentice stood beside the mold with an iron wedge in his hands. He was young, nervous, and far too eager to prove that he belonged there. The master had warned him to keep his sleeves tied tight. He had warned him to watch the crucible and never turn his eyes away while the metal was moving. But the boy was too slow. The mold shook inside its iron bands. The apprentice bent forward to drive the wedge into place, and the loose end of his sleeve caught against a hook. He tried to pull free. His elbow struck the arm of the crucible. For one strange moment, everything seemed to stop. The crucible tilted. Molten bronze spilled over its edge, and the light from it covered the apprentice's face. In that bright glow, he looked almost holy, like the painted image of a young saint above an altar. His eyes opened wide. His mouth formed a small circle of surprise. Then the bronze touched him. His sleeve turned black at once. Fire climbed his arm. The boy screamed. The master reached for him, but his hand closed around empty air. His fist tightened as though he could catch the scream itself and force it back into the boy's throat. The apprentice fell against the mold, then stumbled away, knocking over tools and kicking up gray dust. The other workers pulled him from the foundry. His boots dragged through soot and sand. Behind him remained a trail of black handprints, drops of blood, and scraps of burned cloth. When the doors closed, the foundry became quiet. The furnace still roared, but the men no longer heard it in the same way. None of them spoke. Some stared at the spilled bronze. Others looked at the mold, where the metal inside continued to move and settle. The casting was ruined. Everyone knew it. The master stood alone beside the mold as the bronze slowly cooled. The air smelled of burned skin, hot tin, charcoal, and wet clay. He watched the bright surface become darker. A rough crust formed across it, dull and uneven, like a scab growing over a wound. He could not stop thinking about the apprentice's scream. It had been sharp at first, then broken and weak as the men carried him away. The sound had seemed to travel into the mold. The master imagined it trapped inside the bronze, buried among the small air holes and hidden flaws. He imagined it waiting. Tomorrow, the workers would break the outer shell and uncover the bell. They would clean it, polish it, and test its voice with a hammer. They would say the accident had changed the cast. They would say the tone was deeper than expected, or richer than any bell they had made before. They would not speak the apprentice's name. The master already knew what the bell would sound like. Even before the bronze had fully cooled, he could hear something moving inside it. It was faint, but it was there. A thin note of fear seemed to twist beneath the metal, tight as a wire. That night he went home, but he did not sleep. Whenever he closed his eyes, he saw the apprentice's face shining in the molten light. He heard the sleeve catch. He saw the crucible tilt. He heard the scream begin again. Near midnight, the master sat up in bed. A long sound rolled through the darkness. At first, he thought it came from the wind pushing against the shutters. Then he understood that the noise was not outside his house. It was inside his memory. It sounded like metal cooling. It sounded like a young man crying out beneath the earth. The next morning, the foundry workers broke open the mold. The bell was not perfect. There were dark marks along one side and a narrow crack near the lip. Yet when they struck it with a small hammer, the note that came from it was so deep and clear that every man in the room became still. One worker smiled and said it was the finest tone the foundry had ever produced. Another crossed himself. The master said nothing. Under the main note, he heard the scream. The bell was lifted from the pit and carried to the church. Ropes groaned under its weight. Wheels sank into the winter mud. Men cursed as they dragged it through the town, while children ran beside the wagon and reached out to touch the cold bronze. The apprentice had died during the night. His body was buried without ceremony outside the town walls. His family could not afford a stone. By the time the bell reached the church, most people had already begun to speak of the accident as something finished. The master knew it was not finished. When the bell was raised into the tower, his hands remained steady. He helped guide the ropes and watched the bronze disappear above him. The townspeople gathered in the square below. They stood with their arms folded against the February cold. Some held their hats in both hands. Others looked up with pale faces, waiting for the first toll. The priest climbed the tower and blessed the bell. Incense smoke drifted under the wooden beams, but it could not cover the smell that still seemed to cling to the bronze. The master could smell burned cloth and flesh beneath the sweetness. A young boy climbed the ladder to fasten the clapper. Old cuts and scabs covered his forearms. His sleeves hung loose around his wrists. The master wanted to shout at him. Keep your hands clear. Tie your sleeves. Do not look away. But the words gathered in his throat and would not come out. The boy finished his work and climbed down. The rope was pulled. The bell began to swing. The clapper struck. The note exploded over the town. Birds burst from the belfry and filled the sky. Dogs began to bark. Several children covered their ears. The sound was not the dull complaint of iron or the bright call of a wedding bell. It sounded like an open wound. The master had known what he would hear, but knowing did not protect him. Beneath the bronze tone was the apprentice's scream, clear and raw. Yet there were other voices inside it as well. He heard men burned by furnaces, women crying beside graves, children calling for mothers who would never answer. He heard every soul that had ever moved too close to flame and understood, one moment too late, that pain was coming. For a single breath, before the echo softened, the master heard something else. He heard the apprentice, as he had been before the accident. A young man who still believed there might be more to life than work, heat, and fear. A boy who had imagined becoming a master one day. A boy who had thought the world might hold something for him besides suffering. Then the sound faded. The people in the square began to cheer. The master looked up at the bell and felt sick. They rang it for 12 years. It rang when children were baptized. It rang when couples were married. It rang when old women were carried to the grave and when farmers returned safely from floods. Every time it sounded, the master heard the apprentice. The voice was never exactly the same. Sometimes it was hidden deep beneath the note. Sometimes it came forward so clearly that the master expected others to notice. No one ever did. To the townspeople, it was only a fine bell. To the master, it was the sound of a boot slipping on a wet stair. It was the gasp of a man who realized he was falling. It was the last breath before pain. When war came, the town rang the bell at dawn to call men to the square. The master was too old to join the soldiers, but his hearing remained sharp. He stood in the cold and listened as fathers said goodbye to their children. He heard the bell shake above them, calling young men toward blood and fire. The apprentice's voice trembled within every toll. By then, the master understood that the accident had changed him. He no longer heard bells as other people did. Every village wanted its own bell. Some ordered small bells for gates or animals. Others wanted great church bells that could be heard across valleys. A mountain village requested a bell loud enough to frighten wolves. A wealthy merchant ordered one only to show that he could afford it. The master made them all. But every casting revealed something more than metal. A bell made during Lent carried the ache of hunger. It rang as though an empty stomach had learned to speak. Easter bells, covered in gold, cried out against darkness, bright but desperate. A convent ordered a bell after one of its young women disappeared. When it was finished, its voice sounded weak and broken, like someone calling from behind a locked door. The master began to study the foundry in a new way. He learned how sound moved through stone walls. He learned where dust softened a voice and where the roof beams sharpened it. He discovered that fear could remain inside bronze long after the men who felt it were gone. Grief settled deep in the metal. Hope clung to the edge. Sometimes, when a bell cooled, he could hear the feelings of the people who had worked around it. A tired man's anger, a widow's prayer, a child's laughter from outside the foundry doors. The sounds were not always clear words. Most were no more than small changes in tone. Yet the master learned to understand them. The bells were carrying memories. They traveled upriver on padded wagons, held in place by thick ropes and wooden braces. The drivers treated them carefully, as if one hard jolt might break the whole world. Sometimes the master rode beside them. He wanted to hear how each bell changed when it reached its new home. He listened as bells settled into forests, hills, river valleys, and cold stone towers. Villagers always gathered for the first ringing. Women often cried without knowing why. Men pressed their lips together and stared at the ground. Children looked toward the tower with wide eyes. The master always watched the moment before the bell was struck. That silence had become important to him. Then the sound would roll outward, across fields and roofs, over water and through trees. Every bell carried a hidden note meant for no one. Once, on a wide plain stripped bare by winter wind, he heard his father's voice inside a bell. His father had been dead for almost 40 years. The sound lasted only a moment, but the master knew it. He heard the tired way his father used to say his name. He heard the cough that had followed him through his final winter. The master returned home and could not speak for several days. Years passed. Apprentices came and went. Some became skilled workers. Others left after burns, broken bones, or fear drove them away. A few died. Most simply vanished into ordinary lives, leaving behind nothing but soot-covered tools and faint echoes. The master remembered all of them. New bells appeared on church towers, manor gates, schools, markets, and old priory walls. Every one held something from the moment of its making. To others, they were objects. To him, they were graves. At night, he dreamed that all the bells he had created rang together. Their voices crossed mountains and rivers. He heard curses that had never been finished, lullabies sung to dead children, and the last breath of men who had died far from home. He often woke before dawn, convinced the forge was full of voices. One evening, as winter was beginning to loosen its grip, a messenger arrived from the bishop. The man came without warning. His boots were strangely clean, but his voice sounded worn from travel. He carried a folded letter sealed with dark red wax. The seal was so detailed that the master almost imagined he could hear it crack when the messenger opened it. The request inside was simple, but impossible. The bishop wanted a bell for a new cathedral. It was to be larger than any bell in the province. Its voice should have reached across fields, villages, rivers, and forests. But the noble family paying for the cathedral did not want noise. They wanted a bell whose sound did not travel. A bell so great that it would silence itself. The master read the letter twice. Then he read it a third time. He ran his thumb across the page. His skin had grown smooth and hard from years of work, like stone worn by a river. The order should have been refused. Instead, it entered his mind like a splinter, a great bell that could not be heard. For days, he drew designs. He changed the shape of the bell, made the lip thicker, narrowed the waist, and widened the crown. Nothing worked. A bell made in any normal shape would ring. The larger it became, the farther its voice would travel. He spoke with masons, priests, and metalworkers. He sent questions to scholars. He even visited a strange musician in another town who claimed he had once tuned a harpsichord to match the cry of a dog. None of them could help. Every night, the master lay awake, while failed shapes rang inside his head. He began walking along the river in the dark. He listened to the wind push through the broken remains of an abbey. He counted crows returning to their nests. He heard melting snow drip onto dead leaves. The world seemed filled with endless noise. Water moved beneath ice. Trees scraped against one another. Distant hammers struck stone. Even the stars seemed to hum above him. For the first time in his life, the master became afraid of silence. What would remain if all sound stopped? Would the hidden voices inside the bells still exist? Would the apprentice still be there? Back at the foundry, he made smaller models from wax and sand. He shaved their sides thinner and thinner until almost nothing remained. He watched the young apprentices as they worked. He watched how they spoke, how they laughed, and how they listened. He noticed the spaces left behind after they went home. He remembered every worker who had passed through the foundry. Not only those who had died, but those who had simply left. He wondered what kind of bell could hold an absence instead of a scream. The answer came to him in the middle of the night. He woke with the taste of iron in his mouth. The room was so quiet that he could hear his own blood moving. Then he understood. A bell carried the voice of the moment in which it was born. To make a bell of silence, he needed a voice that had never existed. He needed someone who had never spoken. There was a girl who cleaned the cathedral after evening prayers. She swept the nave, washed the stone near the altar, and replaced burned candles. She never sang with the others. During hymns, her lips moved, but no sound came from them. Some said she had been born without a voice. Others claimed terror had taken it from her when she was small. Her eyes were the gray-blue color of lake water. Her steps were so quiet that people often turned and found her standing near them without having heard her approach. The master watched her for several weeks. At first, he told himself he was studying her. Then, he admitted that he was waiting for courage. The night before the casting, he left a piece of bread on the floor near the baptistry. Food was scarce that winter. The girl found it after prayers. She looked around before bending to pick it up. The master stepped from the shadows. He placed one hand over her mouth, though there was no need. His other arm closed around her neck. She fought him, but she made no sound. That was the worst part. There was no scream, no cry for help. Only the scrape of her shoes against stone and the soft movement of cloth. He told himself he would make it quick. Her body weakened in his arms. Even after she stopped moving, her eyes remained open. They stared at him as though she were waiting for something to begin. The master carried her to the foundry. The bell was cast during the coldest week of Lent. The river had frozen along its edges, and the wind cut through every crack in the building. The mold was buried deep in the casting pit. The master sent the apprentices away. There were no witnesses. He prepared the metal alone. He fed the furnace until bronze glowed inside the crucible. Then he brought the girl to the pit. He did not pray. He did not speak her name. When the bronze was poured, there was no accident. No sleeve caught. No worker cried out. No one screamed. The metal flowed into the mold in complete silence. Even the furnace seemed far away. The master's breathing sounded weak and muffled, as though he were standing underwater. As the bronze cooled, the foundry became quieter than any place he had ever known. The walls did not echo. The tools made no sound when he set them down. For one terrible moment, he placed a hand over his heart because he could not hear it beating. He knew then that he had succeeded. He also knew that he had made something evil. The bell was enormous. It took dozens of men to drag it from the foundry. Its surface was smooth and dark, without the usual marks and flaws. News of it spread across the province. People traveled for days to see the great bell that promised not sound, but the end of sound. On the morning it was raised, the roads around the cathedral were crowded. Farmers stood beside nobles. Priests mixed with beggars. Children climbed walls and trees for a better view. The bishop himself entered the tower. Priests in white linen followed him up the stairs. The master stood away from the crowd. His hands were cut and raw from the work. He looked at the sky because he could not bear to look at the bell. He thought of the girl. He realized he did not know her name. The rope was pulled. The bell swung once, then twice. The great bronze tongue struck its side. No sound came. Story 2. Working as an emergency medical technician is about as difficult as most people imagine. The hours are long, the nights are worse, and the shifts never seem to end when the calls keep coming. Some days are filled with small injuries and frightened people who only need reassurance. Other days leave you staring at the ceiling long after your shift is over, wondering whether you could have done something differently. I was a paramedic for several years. I started training as an intern when I was 17. At that age, I believed I understood what I was getting into. I had watched medical shows, read books, and listened to experienced paramedics tell stories about accidents, overdoses, shootings, and sudden deaths. I thought I was prepared because I knew how to stop bleeding, perform CPR, check vital signs, and stay calm in an emergency. By the time I was 21, I was officially on the payroll. That was when I learned that training could never fully prepare someone for the job. Real emergencies did not happen in clean rooms with bright lighting and organized equipment. They happened on highways in pouring rain, inside filthy bathrooms, behind locked doors, and in homes where terrified families screamed over one another. Sometimes people became violent. Sometimes they lied. Sometimes they were too afraid or confused to explain what had happened. The worst part was that we were often sent into situations with very little information. When a call came in, the dispatcher usually gave us an address and a simple description, such as an injured person, difficulty breathing, or possible mental health emergency. We were trained not to waste time demanding every detail. Our job was to arrive quickly, assess the situation, and begin treatment. Most of the time, this system worked. The night I am about to describe was different. I have told very few people the full story. Some of my old coworkers know parts of it, but I have never been comfortable speaking about everything I saw. Even now, years later, I sometimes wake in the middle of the night because I can hear that girl screaming. I can also hear her final words. The call came near the end of a late shift. My partner and I had already been working for several hours. We were tired, hungry, and hoping the night might remain quiet long enough for us to return to the station and drink some coffee. Then the radio came alive. The dispatcher gave us an address on the outskirts of the city and told us there was a possible medical emergency involving a teenage girl. That was all the information we received. My partner started the ambulance while I confirmed the address. Within seconds, we were on the road with the siren screaming and the emergency lights flashing across the dark buildings. Neither of us knew what we were driving toward. At first, the route took us through familiar streets. We passed closed shops, apartment buildings, and traffic lights that changed automatically for the ambulance. The city was quiet, but there were still a few cars on the road. As we traveled farther from the center, the buildings became smaller and farther apart. Streetlights appeared less often. The pavement grew rough, and trees began to surround the road. The navigation system directed us onto a narrow, rural lane. My partner glanced at me and asked whether I was sure the address was correct. I checked it again. It was. The lane eventually became a dirt road. The ambulance shook as the tires moved over deep holes and loose stones. Branches scraped along the sides of the vehicle. The emergency lights reflected from the trees, creating strange red and blue shapes among the leaves. We followed the dirt road for nearly a mile before the navigation system announced that we had reached the property. At first, we could not see a house. Then, our headlights revealed a narrow driveway leading uphill through thick trees. The entrance was too tight for the ambulance. Trees grew close on both sides, and the ground dropped sharply near the edge. If we tried to drive farther, we risked becoming trapped or damaging the vehicle. We parked along the side of the dirt road as close to the driveway as possible. My partner shut off the siren, but left the emergency lights on. We each grabbed a medical bag and began walking toward the house. The night was cold and unusually quiet. There were no nearby homes, no traffic, and no dogs barking in the distance. The only sounds were our footsteps and the equipment moving inside our bags. As we climbed the driveway, the house slowly appeared through the trees. It was a 2-story building with a wide front porch. Most of the windows were dark, but light shone from the front hall and one upstairs room. Before we reached the porch, we noticed the mess across the lawn. Clothing was scattered everywhere. Shirts, trousers, socks, and underwear lay among the grass. Some of the clothes were caught in bushes. Others had been thrown onto the roof of a small shed. There were also broken household items, rubbish bags, shoes, books, and pieces of shattered glass. It looked as though someone had emptied an entire bedroom through the front door. Then we heard the screaming. It came from inside the house. The sound was so loud and violent that both of us stopped walking. I had heard people scream in pain before. I had heard parents scream after finding their children injured. I had heard patients scream during seizures, panic attacks, and psychotic episodes. This was not like any of those sounds. It was deep, rough, and animal-like. The scream began as a high cry, then dropped into a low growl that seemed impossible for a young person to produce. My partner looked at me. Neither of us spoke. We continued toward the porch, but more slowly than before. The front door was closed. My partner lifted his hand and knocked. The door opened almost immediately. A tall man stood in front of us. He appeared to be in his late 40s or early 50s. His shirt was unbuttoned, and he wore a stained white tank top underneath. His hair was wet with sweat, and his face was so pale that he looked sick. His eyes were red and swollen, as though he had been crying for hours. In his right hand, he held a Bible. He gripped it so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. "Please," he said. "Please help her." Another scream came from deeper inside the house. The man grabbed my partner by the sleeve and pulled him through the doorway. I followed them inside. The blood was the first thing I noticed. It covered the floor near the entrance. There were handprints on one wall and long streaks across the wooden boards. A trail of blood led down a hallway toward the back of the house. The air smelled of sweat, metal, and something sour. The man hurried us along the hallway. He kept speaking, but his words came too quickly for me to understand. He said something about his daughter, a knife, and evil spirits. The blood trail ended at a closed bedroom door. The handle had been damaged, and there were deep marks in the wood. The door appeared to be locked from the inside. Beyond it, the screaming continued. Between the screams, I heard another sound. It was wet and rhythmic. A soft, repeated squelching noise came from inside the room. At the time, I did not understand what it was. I set down my medical bag and moved closer to the door. "Can you hear me?" I called. "My name is Daniel. I'm a paramedic. We're here to help you." The screaming stopped instantly. The sudden silence was almost worse. I waited with my hand near the door. My partner pulled the father a few steps away and began asking questions. We needed to know the girl's age, medical history, medications, and what had happened before we arrived. The man struggled to answer. His daughter was 17 years old. According to him, she had never experienced anything like this before. She had no history of serious mental illness, no known drug problem, and no major medical condition. Earlier that evening, she had come downstairs behaving strangely. At first, she had been quiet. Then she began emptying drawers, breaking objects, and throwing her belongings outside. She tore off her clothes and threw those onto the lawn as well. Her father tried to stop her. She responded by slamming her head into the walls. When he attempted to restrain her, she grabbed a kitchen knife and ran upstairs. She locked herself inside her room and began screaming. The father had called emergency services, but while waiting for us, he had also started praying outside her door. That explained the Bible. I knocked again. Please unlock the door, I said. You may be injured. We only want to help. For several seconds, there was no response. Then, a voice came from the other side. Leave me alone. The words were clear, but the voice did not sound like the frightened voice of a teenage girl. It was harsh, deep, and broken. The final word rose into a piercing screech that shook the door. The father covered his ears, his face twisted with fear and grief. That is not my daughter, he whispered. Before either of us could stop him, he rushed toward the door. He threw his shoulder against it. The frame shook, but the lock held. My partner grabbed his arm and tried to pull him back. The man screamed his daughter's name and kicked the door. Once, twice, on the third kick, the wood around the lock split. The door flew open. What I saw inside that bedroom has remained with me ever since. The girl lay on the bed. She was completely naked. Blood covered the sheets and poured onto the floor. In one hand, she held a kitchen knife. She was stabbing herself in the stomach. The wet sound we had heard was the blade entering her body. She had already cut and stabbed herself dozens of times. There were wounds across her abdomen, chest, arms, and thighs. Some were shallow, but others were deep enough that I could see tissue beneath the skin. She should have been unconscious. She should not have been able to move. Instead, she raised the knife and drove it into herself again. Her face showed no pain. She looked directly at me. Her eyes were wide and badly bloodshot. Her expression was completely empty, as if she were watching something happening to another person. Then, she screamed. The sound was deafening inside the small room. I reacted without thinking. I rushed forward, climbed onto the edge of the bed, and grabbed her wrist before she could stab herself again. She fought me immediately. The force of it shocked me. She was thin and looked as though she weighed less than half of what I did, but she twisted her arm with enough strength to nearly throw me from the bed. Her teeth snapped close to my face. She growled and tried to bite my hand. I tightened my grip around her wrist and used my other hand to force her fingers open. She screamed louder. Her father stood in the doorway, crying and calling her name. My partner moved to the other side of the bed and helped pin down her shoulders. It took both of us to remove the knife. Her fingers were locked around the handle. One at a time, I pulled them loose. As soon as the knife came free, I threw it across the room. It struck the wall and landed in the corner. The girl continued fighting. Her entire body shook and twisted. She tried to headbutt us, scratch us, and bite anything she could reach. Blood made her skin slippery. Every time we thought we had control of her, she moved again. I had treated people under the influence of powerful drugs before. Some drugs could make patients unusually strong, aggressive, or unaware of pain. This felt different. Her wounds were too serious. She had lost too much blood. Her body should have been weak, but she resisted us with the strength of a fully grown man. We used medical restraints on her wrists and ankles, but even those did not seem strong enough. She pulled so hard that the straps stretched. We covered her with a clean sheet and began moving her toward the front door. Her father followed us, still holding the Bible. The girl screamed continuously as we carried her through the hallway. At times, the scream became a growl. At other moments, it sounded like several voices fighting to come from the same throat. I told myself that it was only the shape of the hallway changing the sound. I still do not know whether I believe that. Getting her down the driveway was almost impossible. The path was narrow and uneven, and the stretcher wheels could not move properly over the dirt. We had no choice but to support most of its weight ourselves. The girl thrashed against the restraints the entire way. By the time we reached the ambulance, I was breathing heavily and my arms were shaking. I climbed into the patient compartment and pulled the stretcher toward the open back doors. My partner and the father pushed from outside. As we lifted the girl inside, both of her arms suddenly shot toward the right side of the entrance. I still do not understand how she freed them from the straps so quickly. Her fingers gripped the metal frame of the ambulance. She held on with incredible force. My partner tried to pull her hand away, but she dug her fingers deeper into the edge. Her nails bent backward. Then the middle and index fingernails on her left hand snapped off completely. Blood ran down her fingers. She did not release her grip. Instead, she screamed harder. Together, we forced her hands away from the frame and secured her again. This time, we added extra restraints and checked every buckle. Her father climbed into the back of the ambulance with me. My partner closed the doors, hurried to the driver's seat, and began the journey toward the hospital. The ambulance shook as we traveled back along the dirt road. Equipment rattled in the cabinets. The emergency lights flashed through the rear windows. I began assessing the girl. Her condition was worse than I had realized inside the house. She had suffered severe internal injuries. Several stab wounds were deep, and her abdomen was badly damaged. Her pulse was dangerously fast, her blood pressure was falling, and her breathing was shallow. I applied pressure where I could and began emergency treatment. Her father sat near her feet, crying and praying. He asked me repeatedly whether she would survive. I could not give him an honest answer. The truth was that I did not understand how she had survived long enough for us to arrive. Then, without warning, the screaming stopped. The silence filled the ambulance. The girl's head slowly turned toward me. Her eyes were still open, but the wild anger had disappeared. For the first time, she looked frightened. "Can you hear me?" I asked. She did not answer. Her eyes moved toward her father. The man leaned closer and took her hand. "It's me," he said. "Dad is here." The girl stared at him as if she did not recognize him. Then her expression changed. The confusion on her face was real. It looked nothing like the empty stare she had worn in the bedroom. Her eyes filled with tears. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. I leaned closer. "What are you trying to say?" Her breathing became weaker. The monitor showed her heart rate dropping. I called to my partner and told him to drive faster. The father squeezed her hand and begged her to stay awake. The girl looked into his eyes. In a soft, ordinary voice, she whispered, "How did we get here?" Those were her final words. Her eyes closed. The monitor alarm began sounding. Her heart stopped before we reached the hospital. I started CPR immediately. I performed chest compressions while preparing medication and checking her airway. Her father moved to the corner of the ambulance, sobbing and begging God to save her. We continued trying to revive her until the moment the ambulance doors opened at the emergency entrance. A medical team rushed forward and took control. They worked on her as she was moved inside. Nothing helped. She was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The official explanation was that she had suffered a sudden and severe mental breakdown. The doctors also believed she may have taken an unknown substance, though the toxicology tests did not find anything that explained her behavior. Her injuries were listed as self-inflicted. That was the end of the medical report. The police questioned us. They questioned the father. They searched the house and collected the knife. No one found proof that another person had been in the bedroom. There were no signs of anyone breaking into the home. The father had injuries from trying to restrain her, but nothing suggested he had attacked her. As far as the authorities were concerned, it was a terrible but explainable tragedy. I tried to accept that. I returned to work and continued answering calls. I treated car accident victims, people with heart attacks, and children with high fevers. Life continued because emergency work never stopped for long. But certain details remained in my mind. I remembered the clothes scattered across the lawn. I remembered the Bible in the father's hand. I remembered the sound behind the door. Most of all, I remembered the change in the girl's face inside the ambulance. It was as though she had awakened in a place she did not recognize. Sometimes I wondered whether her question had been simple confusion. She had lost blood, suffered shock, and experienced severe trauma. Patients often became confused near death. That was what I told myself. Then, several months later, I saw her father again. He came to the station carrying the same Bible. He looked older. His shoulders had dropped, and his hair had turned noticeably gray. He asked whether he could speak with me privately. We sat in an empty office. For a long time, he said nothing. Then he told me that his daughter had been behaving strangely for several weeks before the night she died. She had complained about hearing footsteps outside her bedroom when no one was there. She sometimes woke in the middle of the night, standing in another part of the house with no memory of leaving her bed. A few days before her death, she told him she had started having dreams about a dark room. In those dreams, she was not alone. She believed something was watching her from a corner. Every night, it came closer. Her father had dismissed the dreams as stress. On the final night, he heard her speaking upstairs. At first, he assumed she was on the phone. Then he realized she was having a conversation with someone who was not there. He stood outside her bedroom and listened. His daughter asked, "What do you want?" A second voice answered. The father refused to tell me exactly what the voice said. He only told me that it did not belong to his daughter. When he opened the door, she attacked him, ran downstairs, and began destroying the house. He believed something had entered her. I told him that grief could cause people to remember events differently. I said there were medical explanations for voices, personality changes, and violent behavior. The words sounded weak even to me. Before leaving, he asked whether I remembered what she said in the ambulance. I told him I did. He lowered his head. "She did not ask how she got into the ambulance," he said. I waited for him to continue. He tightened his fingers around the Bible. "She asked how we got here. I did not understand." Then he explained that the exact same sentence had appeared in her journal 3 days before her death. How did we get here? It was written again and again across several pages. Some of the words had been pressed so hard into the paper that the pen tore through it. The father believed his daughter had not been asking about the ambulance. He believed that for a few seconds before she died, she had returned to herself. She had looked at the world around her and realized that she had lost control of her own body. She did not know how she had reached that moment. I never saw her father again after that day. I do not know whether his explanation was true. Perhaps the girl suffered from an undiagnosed illness. Perhaps she took a drug that disappeared from her system before testing. Perhaps shock and blood loss caused her voice, strength, and behavior to seem more unusual than they were. Those are the explanations I try to believe. Still, every now and then, we were called to another patient who claimed to hear voices or feel something watching from the darkness. Whenever that happened, I remembered the girl on the bed. I remembered the way she stared through me while driving the knife into her body. I remembered the sound of her fingernails snapping against the ambulance. And I remembered the moment her eyes became human again. After years of emergency work, I eventually left the job. People often assume it was because of the long hours or the stress. That is not true. I left because I became afraid of entering people's homes at night. Every time I stood outside a locked bedroom door and heard movement on the other side, I expected to hear that voice again. Leave me alone. Sometimes, when I wake suddenly in the dark, I find myself listening for footsteps outside my room. I have never heard them. Not yet. But whenever I think about that night, one question still remains in my mind. It is the same question that frightened girl asked while looking into her father's eyes. How did we get here? Story 3. I still cannot believe I went through with it, but by that point, nothing else had worked. I had tried everything I could think of. I had performed spells I found online. I had paid other people to perform spells for me. I had reported what she was doing to the police, the landlord's office, and anyone else who might have been able to help. None of it made any difference. She always won. She had cost me my job. She had killed my dog, though I could never prove it. She had changed the locks on the house and then demanded that I keep paying rent. Whenever I called the police and asked them to help me collect my belongings, they refused to let me inside. She was the spoiled princess of that little town. Her family had money, connections, and a long history there. Everyone knew her name. Her brother was a police officer. 2 of her cousins worked at the courthouse. Her father had donated money to nearly every local charity and public event. I was an outsider. That was all anyone needed to know. I never would have moved to that town if I had understood what I was walking into. I had only gone there because of him. He had told me that he was single, that the house was one of his family's rental properties, and that he was fixing it up before moving somewhere better. Later, I learned that none of that was true. The house belonged to her. He had been dating her for years. He had cheated on her with me inside one of her own properties and then moved me into it without telling either of us the whole truth. By the time I discovered what had happened, he had already crawled back to her. She blamed me for everything, even though he had lied to both of us. That was how I ended up sitting alone in my car outside a deserted office building at 11:53 at night, preparing to perform a ritual I had found on a strange website. The rain had stopped earlier that evening, but the parking lot was still wet. The streetlights reflected in the black water gathered between the cracked lines of the parking spaces. The building in front of me was 3 floors tall, with dark windows and a faded sign where a company name had once been. I looked at the time again, 11:54. I asked myself whether I was really going to do it. The ritual promised to remove a person from your life. It did not say how. It did not promise that the person would die, disappear, move away, or simply lose interest in you. It only said that if you completed the ritual correctly, the person would no longer have power over you. That was enough for me. I took a coin from the cup holder, closed my eyes, and flipped it. I had planned to let the coin decide whether I went inside or drove home. However, the moment the coin left my fingers, I knew what result I wanted. I wanted to go in. The coin struck the dashboard, bounced off the passenger seat, and disappeared somewhere near the floor. I never found out which side it landed on. Maybe that should have been a warning. Maybe it was only another example of how clumsy I became when I was nervous. The truth was that I had already gone too far to stop. The previous night, I had spent hours driving around and checking empty office buildings. I needed a building with at least 3 staircases because the ritual did not allow me to use the same staircase twice in a row. Finding a suitable place had been harder than expected. Most buildings had cameras, alarms, guards, or doors that were impossible to open without proper tools. Eventually, I found this place. One side entrance had an old metal frame, and I discovered that I could push the bolt aside with a thin knife. I could not open a proper lock with a card, but I had always been good with knives. After entering, I had left one of the doors unlocked so I could return the following night. The ritual had very strict rules. I was not allowed to carry weapons inside. I was not allowed to use electronics after the ritual began. I had to start at midnight. I had to place 5 candles in a circle around a mirror, break the mirror, light a separate candle, and walk through the broken glass. Then I had to climb and descend every staircase in the building. Once that was done, something would enter the building with me. The instructions never explained what that something was. It only called it the pursuer. After midnight, I had to keep moving until dawn. I could not remain still for more than 30 seconds. I could not turn around unless I had reached a corner. I could not look directly into the broken mirror at the starting point. Most importantly, I could not let my candle go out. If I survived until dawn, the person I wanted removed would lose their control over my life. I left my phone in the reception area because the instructions allowed electronics to remain at the starting point. I also left my knife outside beneath a bush near the side door. Then I entered the building. The reception area was larger than it had seemed the night before. A long desk stood in front of several abandoned offices. Old chairs sat along one wall, and a clock hung above a doorway leading deeper into the building. I decided to set up behind the reception desk, where the candlelight would be less visible from outside. I had bought 5 large jar candles from a drugstore. The instructions did not specify what kind of candles I needed, so I chose the ones with the longest burning times. Unfortunately, the only long-lasting ones came in different scents. One smelled like cheap vanilla. Another claimed to smell like clean cotton. 2 were called White Lily. The last one smelled like something named Peaceful Sunrise, though it smelled more like soap and melted sugar. I placed the 5 candles in a circle on the floor. As soon as I lit them, their scents mixed into a thick, unpleasant cloud. Dawn was still more than 5 hours away. If even one candle went out before then, the ritual would fail. I placed the wall mirror in the center of the circle. For a few seconds, I stared at my reflection. My hair was pulled back badly. My face looked pale in the candlelight. There were dark shadows beneath my eyes because I had barely slept in days. "You are an idiot," I whispered to myself. Then I lifted the mirror and threw it down. The crash was far louder than I expected. The sound shot through the empty building and returned in waves. Glass scattered across the floor, sliding beneath the desk and bouncing off the walls. I froze. For one terrible second, I expected an alarm to begin ringing or a security guard to come running. Nothing happened. The building remained silent. I nearly forgot the next step. With shaking hands, I lit the thin candle I would carry. I held it in front of me, stepped through the circle of jar candles, and crossed over the broken mirror. The clock above the doorway clicked to midnight. I started walking. I had to keep moving for the rest of the night, so I chose an easy pace. The small candle did not provide much light. It illuminated only a few feet around me, leaving the end of every hallway buried in darkness. The first staircase was near the reception area. I climbed to the second floor, walked across the building, and used another staircase to reach the third. The offices were empty. Some rooms still contained desks and filing cabinets, while others had been cleared completely. Old calendars hung on the walls. A few chairs had been left in waiting areas. One office had a dead plant beside the window. I found the third staircase near the back of the building and returned to the ground floor. Then I repeated the pattern using different staircases. The candle flame bent whenever I walked too quickly. I learned to hold one hand around it, protecting it from the air created by my own movement. At first, the building frightened me. Every shadow looked like a person standing in a doorway. Every quiet sound made me think someone had entered through the unlocked door. After the first hour, however, I became used to it. The office building stopped feeling haunted and started feeling empty. I began to feel embarrassed. I was a grown woman walking around an abandoned office building with a candle because strangers on the internet had claimed that a supernatural creature would remove my enemy from my life. The whole thing was ridiculous. I thought about stopping, but the instructions warned that quitting after the ritual began could allow the pursuer to follow you outside. I did not believe that, but I was not willing to test it. I continued walking. The website said that staying on the same floor for too long would help the pursuer locate me. Because of that, I kept changing levels. I wandered through different hallways, past the reception area, climbed one staircase, crossed the floor, and descended another. For a while, it was almost easy. Sometime after 2 in the morning, I passed an office with a narrow glass panel beside the door. Something moved in the reflection. I stopped. The rules said I had to keep moving, but fear locked my legs for several seconds. I turned my head slightly and looked at the glass again. Only my own reflection stared back. My eyes were wide. My face looked frightened and unfamiliar in the weak candlelight. I let out the breath I had been holding. "You are tired," I whispered. "That's all." I forced myself to walk again. During the next hour, I thought I saw movement several more times. A shadow passed behind me in a dark window. A shape seemed to stand at the far end of a hallway. A reflection remained still when I moved. Each time I told myself it was exhaustion. I had worked myself into a frightened state before even entering the building. My mind expected to see something, so it was creating shapes out of darkness. That explanation helped until the footsteps started. At first, they were so faint that I could barely hear them. A soft step. Then another. They seemed to come from somewhere behind me. I stopped listening, and the sound disappeared. When I paid attention again, it returned. Step, step, step. The rhythm did not match my own. I walked faster. The footsteps also became faster. I remembered the rule. Never turn around unless you are in a corner. I did not know why the ritual included that rule. Maybe turning around allowed the pursuer to attack. Maybe seeing it gave it power. Whatever the reason, I kept my eyes forward. On my next trip through the ground floor, I passed the starting point. The 5 jar candles still burned around the broken mirror. My phone sat on the reception desk beside an energy drink and a bag of food. I opened the drink, took a few quick mouthfuls, and grabbed something to eat while walking. I had tried not to drink too much because I did not want to use the bathroom, but that plan had failed. The energy drink made it worse. The building's bathrooms were on the second floor. Using one by candlelight was more disturbing than I expected. The bathroom was lined with mirrors. I had nowhere to place the candle, so I had to hold it in one hand while managing everything else with the other. The flame shook in the mirror. Because the room was so dark, the reflection looked like another person holding a candle across from me. When I moved, it moved. When I looked away, I could still see the light in the edge of my vision. At one point, the reflected flame vanished. I jumped so hard that I almost dropped my candle. Then I realized I had moved beyond the end of the mirror. I laughed quietly at myself, but the sound came out weak. I left as quickly as possible. I promised myself I would not use that bathroom again. The later it became, the less important my reasons for doing the ritual seemed. My anger at her, my ruined job, my dead dog, and all the things trapped inside the house started to blur together. I felt sorry for myself. I felt foolish. More than anything, I felt tired. My legs hurt from climbing stairs. My eyes burned. The hand holding the candle had become stiff. The footsteps continued. They were louder now. Sometimes they seemed far behind me. Other times, they sounded as though they were only a few feet away. I wanted to turn around. Every part of my body screamed at me to look. I imagined a person following me. I imagined a security guard, a homeless stranger, or one of her friends. Almost any normal explanation would have been better than not knowing. But I followed the rule. I did not turn. I also tried not to look into office windows. Reflections became more frightening as the night continued. In some of them, I thought I saw a dark shape standing behind me. It did not have a clear body. It looked like a patch of darkness that somehow glowed. That description makes no sense, but it is the closest I can come to explaining it. It was darker than the hallway around it, yet I could always tell exactly where it was. The shape became clearer each time I saw it. The temperature in the building dropped. I told myself that fear and adrenaline were making my skin feel cold. Then, my breath began appearing in front of me. The footsteps moved closer. I checked the clock above the reception area every time I passed. At first, time had moved normally. Then it seemed to slow down. I passed the clock once and saw that it was 3:41. After walking what felt like 20 minutes, climbing 2 staircases and crossing the entire 3rd floor, I returned to the clock. It said 3:43. I stared at it. Maybe the battery was dying. Maybe I was too tired to remember the previous time correctly. I kept walking. The next time I passed, it said 3:44. The footsteps were no longer faint. Something followed me down the hallway. I could hear the weight of each step. It was not running, but it did not need to. It knew I was trapped inside until dawn. Eventually, I had to use the bathroom again. I tried to wait, but fear and the energy drink made it impossible. I entered the 2nd floor bathroom and moved quickly. The reflected candle appeared across from me. This time, another shadow stood beside it. I did not look directly at the mirror. I kept my eyes lowered and told myself it was only my coat, a stall door, or the darkness behind me. Then, I heard footsteps outside the bathroom. They stopped directly beyond the door. I held my breath. The candle flame bent toward the entrance, though there was no wind. For 1 second, I thought something would come inside. Instead, The footsteps started again. They moved away down the hall. I left the bathroom and turned in the opposite direction. The footsteps returned almost immediately. They were behind me again. I walked faster. The flame shook violently in my hand. I saw the dark shape in a glass panel. It was much closer than before. Fear finally broke through my control. I ran. The pursuer ran too. Its footsteps struck the floor behind me, heavy and fast. I reached the end of the hallway and turned the corner without looking back. I rushed down a staircase, nearly falling as I skipped steps. The candle remained lit. When I reached the floor below, I slowed to a walk. I waited for the panic to return. It did not. Something inside me had changed. Maybe it was because false dawn was approaching. Maybe I had been afraid for so long that my mind had run out of fear. Maybe exhaustion had finally shut down the part of me that cared. Whatever the reason, I became calm, not normal calm. It felt as though I had risen out of my own body and floated above my emotions. Beneath me, anger, fear, sadness, and panic moved like waves across a stormy lake. I could see them. I knew they were there. But they could not reach me. The footsteps continued behind me. I no longer cared. The cold air touched my skin. I continued walking. Dawn should have arrived sometime after 5, but the building remained dark. The clock seemed stuck. I walked for what felt like hours after sunrise should have come. Eventually, I stopped beside a hallway window. Gray daylight filled the sky outside. The ritual was over. I blew out my candle. Then I lay down on the floor. I was too exhausted to clean anything or leave the building. Sleep washed over me before I could make another decision. When I woke, sunlight filled the hallway. For a few seconds, I did not know where I was. Then I remembered everything. I sat up in horror. The candles downstairs. I had left them burning. I rushed to the reception area, expecting to find smoke or flames. To my surprise, the building had not burned down. 2 of the jar candles were still lit, their small flames struggling in deep pools of melted wax. The others had burned out. I blew out the remaining candles, placed their lids on them, and began cleaning. I swept up every piece of broken mirror I could find. I packed the candles, food wrappers, and other supplies into a bag. Before leaving, I checked the building carefully to make sure no one had entered while I slept. I saw no one. There were no footprints behind me, no sign of the dark shape, no proof that anything had happened. Outside, I found my knife beneath the bush and returned to my car. When I turned on my phone, it filled with missed calls and messages. Most were from her. She said I could come to the house and collect my belongings. Anything left there after that night would be burned. My first reaction was anger. That bitch. I almost threw the phone across the car. Then I breathed slowly. The strange calm returned. At least she was finally letting me inside. I had not brought much when I moved there. Everything important could fit inside my car. I sent a short reply saying I would come that afternoon. When I reached the house, a party was already happening. Cars filled the driveway and lined both sides of the road. Music came from the backyard. People stood in the kitchen and living room with drinks in their hands. It seemed as though every friend she had, along with everyone who wanted to impress her family, had been invited. He was there too. The man who had lied to me. He stood close to her, touching her arm and whispering into her ear as if they were deeply in love. At least he had enough shame to move away when I entered. I ignored both of them and went to the bedroom I had used. Someone had kicked the door open. The lock was broken, and the wood around the frame had split. Every drawer had been emptied. My clothes, papers, and personal items had been thrown across the floor. Someone had opened boxes and gone through everything I owned. I started packing. I kept track of each item as I placed it into bags. Thankfully, she and I wore completely different sizes, so none of my clothes seemed to be missing. A few objects had been broken, but most of them had no personal value. The bedding was ruined. Someone had poured something across it. I could not tell what the liquid was, and I did not want to know. Only the comforter belonged to me. He had purchased the rest. As I packed, I thought about how ridiculous the entire situation had been. He had cheated on her inside her own house. Then he had moved me into that house while pretending it belonged to him. Now they were together again. Once my belongings were safe in my car, I found myself hoping they stayed together for a very long time. They deserved each other. I left behind anything that looked damaged or suspicious. My toothbrush was wet, even though I had not used it in weeks. The shampoo and conditioner looked like someone had mixed something into them. I threw them into the rubbish. The last things I needed were my kitchen knives. My father had bought the set for me as a graduation present shortly before he died. They meant more to me than everything else in that house combined. When I entered the kitchen, I saw several of her drunk friends using them. One man was cutting food directly on the quartz countertop. Another had used my cleaver outside to chop small pieces of wood for a fire. She was holding my favorite knife. The moment I asked for them back, she began making a scene. She said she was afraid to let me near knives. She told everyone I had been violent the first time we met. That was a lie. She called her brother and cried into the phone, asking him to come in his police car and arrest me. Her tears disappeared whenever she thought no one was watching. I became angrier with every word. I reminded myself that losing control would be stupid. This was her town. Most of the police officers would take her side even if she stood over my dead body with a bloody knife in her hand. I tried to remain calm. Then she brought my knife down hard against the quartz countertop. The blade struck the stone with a terrible sound. She did it again, and again. I knew she was damaging the edge. Her friends laughed. They called me names and told me to leave. For a moment, I thought I would lose control. Then the room became cold. I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, heavy, familiar, the calm returned. It filled me completely. Once again, I rose above the storm inside myself. I could feel my anger moving beneath me, but it could not touch me. Something must have changed in my face. She stopped laughing. She looked at me for several seconds, then threw the knife onto the kitchen island. "It's too dull anyway," she complained. She turned her back on me. I picked up the knife. I walked toward her. I was not angry anymore. I was perfectly calm when I slid the blade between her ribs. She gasped. Her body became stiff. For 1 second, no one else in the room understood what had happened. Then she fell. Chaos exploded around me. People screamed and ran. Drinks hit the floor. Someone knocked over a chair. A few large men who looked like former school athletes stepped toward me as though they planned to stop me. I smiled. They froze. One of them grabbed his girlfriend and pushed her in my direction before running toward the door. I was not even chasing him. I laughed. The entire town was full of cowards and rubbish. I moved through the remains of the party, calmly collecting my knives. No one tried to stop me. When I saw what they had done to my cleaver, I almost became angry again. Deep cuts marked the blade from where someone had struck wood and possibly stone. Then the cold air moved across my skin. The anger faded. I carried the knives outside, placed them in my car, and drove away. A police car appeared before I reached the end of the street. Its lights flashed as it raced toward me. I refused to stop. There was no chance I would spend another minute in that town. I swerved around the police car and continued toward the old bridge leading out. More sirens sounded behind me. The police had placed a tire damage strip across the bridge. Part of my mind wondered how a town that could not afford proper training about corruption and favoritism had managed to buy equipment like that. I did not slow down. The tires burst. The car pulled violently to one side. I fought the steering wheel, but the road disappeared beneath me. Metal screamed. Glass shattered. The car struck the barrier and rolled. Through it all, I remained calm. As the world spun, I closed my eyes. When I opened them again, something was sitting beside me. I saw it for only an instant. A shape made of glowing darkness stared back from the passenger seat. I could not see its face, but I knew it was smiling. Then everything went black. I still do not know whether I won the ritual or lost it. The woman no longer has power over my life, so perhaps the ritual worked exactly as promised. But sometimes, when the room becomes cold, I hear footsteps approaching from behind me. I never turn around. I have plenty of time to decide what that means. Story 4. I was not a terrible person. At least that is what I used to tell myself. I had never robbed anyone. I had never hurt anyone on purpose. I paid my bills, went to work, and kept mostly to myself. I was not cruel, violent, or dangerous. I was only ordinary. That was the problem. I had spent most of my life feeling invisible. I was the kind of person people forgot 5 minutes after meeting. I worked as an IT technician for a small company, fixing printers, replacing broken monitors, resetting passwords, and listening to office workers complain that their computers were too slow. It was not a bad job. It paid enough for rent and groceries. But there was nothing interesting about it. Nothing worth telling stories about. I wanted people to look at me with respect. I wanted someone to think I mattered. More than anything, I wanted Julie to think I mattered. Her name was Julie Harper. We met through mutual friends at a small gathering. She worked at a local publishing company, editing school textbooks and historical reference books. She loved history more than anyone I had ever known. She could talk for hours about old battles, lost expeditions, famous leaders, and ordinary people who had done brave things during terrible times. Julie especially loved stories about heroes. She did not care whether they were soldiers, firefighters, explorers, nurses, or people who had saved someone during a disaster. What mattered to her was courage. Whenever she talked about those people, her eyes seemed to shine. I began trying to get her attention almost immediately. At first, I thought being myself would be enough. I told her about my job, my apartment, and the video games I played in my spare time. She listened politely, but I could tell none of it interested her. She never insulted me. Julie was too kind for that, but I could see that I was just another man in the room. For weeks, I looked for ways to make myself seem more impressive. I read articles about famous wars so I could join her conversations. I watched documentaries about military history, memorized dates, and repeated facts I had learned only hours before. It worked a little. Julie began talking to me more often, but I still felt like I was standing outside a locked door. Then, one rainy Saturday morning, I found the key. I had gone downtown to buy a replacement cable for an old stereo system. The electronics store was closed, so I walked around for a while, waiting for the rain to slow down. That was when I noticed the pawn shop. It was squeezed between a laundromat and an empty restaurant. The sign above the door was faded, and several letters had gone dark. I had passed the shop many times, but had never gone inside. That morning, I was cold and tired of standing in the rain, so I entered. A small bell rang over the door. The air smelled of dust, old metal, and cigarette smoke. Glass cases lined the walls, filled with watches, rings, tools, cameras, and objects that looked as though they had been sitting there for decades. The owner sat behind the counter reading a newspaper. He was a heavy man with white hair and thick glasses. He barely looked up when I came in. I walked slowly through the shop. Most of the items did not interest me. There were old guitars, broken lamps, boxes of coins, and several shelves filled with outdated electronics. Then I saw the display case. It was made of dark mahogany and stood upright inside a glass cabinet. The wood was scratched, but it had once been beautiful. A brass latch held the front closed, and the inside was lined with faded red velvet. Several military medals were pinned inside. I recognized some of them from the documentaries I had watched. There was a Purple Heart, a Bronze Star, and several campaign medals with faded ribbons. All of them were old and tarnished. Some had scratches along the edges. I leaned closer to the glass. The medals looked real. They were not costume pieces or cheap copies. Someone had earned them. I imagined the man who had worn them. Perhaps he had fought in Europe. Maybe he had pulled wounded soldiers from a burning vehicle or stayed behind to protect his unit. Whatever he had done, it had been important enough for his country to honor him. I waved to the owner. "Can I look at those medals?" He folded his newspaper with a tired sigh and came over. He unlocked the cabinet and placed the wooden case on the counter. The moment I touched it, I felt a faint vibration beneath my fingers. It was so weak that I almost ignored it. A low hum seemed to come from inside the case. I looked around, expecting to see a fan or heater running nearby, but the shop was quiet except for the rain tapping against the windows. "Where did these come from?" I asked. The owner shrugged. "Estate sale. Old guy died. No family as far as I know. House was full of junk. Do you know his name?" "No." He tapped the wooden case with one finger. "Been sitting here for months. Nobody wants this kind of stuff anymore." The way he called the medals junk bothered me. They had meant something once. To the man who earned them, they had probably carried memories of pain, fear, and loss. To me, however, they offered something else. They offered an identity. They were a shortcut to becoming someone Julie might admire. The thought came quickly, and once it entered my mind, I could not push it away. I asked the price. The owner named an amount much higher than I expected. I argued that the case was damaged and the medals were badly tarnished. After several minutes, he lowered the price. I paid in cash. As I carried the case out of the shop, the glass felt cold against my fingers. The faint humming continued. I told myself it was caused by traffic moving along the wet street. I did not yet have a complete plan. At first, I thought I might simply use the medals to start a conversation with Julie. Perhaps I would say they belonged to my grandfather. That lie seemed small. By the time I reached home, the story had grown. The medals had belonged to me. I had served overseas. I had been wounded. The Purple Heart came from an attack on our convoy. The Bronze Star came from an act of bravery I would refuse to discuss because it was too painful. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror and pinned the medals to an old military-style jacket I had bought online for a costume party years earlier. The result was not convincing to anyone with military knowledge. But Julie was not a soldier. She was a history lover. That evening, I sent her a message asking whether she wanted to have dinner with me. To my surprise, she agreed. I wore the jacket. The medals felt unusually heavy against my chest, even though none of them weighed much. As I left my apartment, I heard the low hum again. This time, it seemed louder. I ignored it. Julie was already sitting at the restaurant when I arrived. The moment she saw the medals, her expression changed. Her eyes widened. "You never told me you were a decorated veteran," she said. There was real admiration in her voice. For the first time since meeting her, I felt important. I sat across from her and gave a small, serious smile. I don't talk about it much. The lie came out easily, too easily. Julie leaned forward. "You served overseas?" I nodded. 2 tours. The details arrived almost by themselves. I told her I had been injured during an attack. I said several men in my unit had died. I claimed that I still had nightmares and did not like loud noises. Every lie made the next one easier. Julie listened with deep concern. She reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. That must have been terrible. A thrill passed through me. She finally saw me as someone worth remembering. Then, pain exploded through my left shoulder. It was sudden and violent, like a burning piece of metal had torn through my flesh. I gasped and nearly dropped my drink. For a second, I could not move my arm. "Are you all right?" Julie asked. The pain disappeared almost as quickly as it had begun. I forced a smile. Old injury. The answer made my lie even stronger. Julie looked at me with sympathy. Behind her, a polished metal light fixture reflected part of the restaurant. In its curved surface, I saw a face. It was the face of an older man. His features were stretched and distorted by the metal, but I could still see his mouth open in a silent scream. His eyes were filled with terror and rage. I turned around. No one was there. When I looked back at the fixture, the face was gone. I told myself it had been another customer's reflection. After dinner, Julie hugged me outside the restaurant. That had never happened before. I should have felt happy. Instead, I felt cold. The medals hummed against my chest all the way home. The pain returned the next morning. I was brushing my teeth when the same burning sensation struck my shoulder. It felt as though a bullet had entered from the front and torn through the back. I dropped the toothbrush and grabbed the sink. The pain lasted only a few seconds, but it left me shaking. When I removed my shirt, there was no wound. My skin looked normal. Over the next few days, the pain returned again and again. It was not like an ordinary muscle ache. It was too exact. I could feel the imagined path of the bullet. I felt it break skin, tear muscle, and strike bone. Sometimes the pain came while I was sitting at work. Other times it woke me in the middle of the night. Then, the nightmares began. In the first dream, I was standing in a trench. Mud covered my boots and reached almost to my ankles. Rain poured from a dark sky. The air smelled of wet earth, blood, smoke, and gunpowder. Men in old uniforms crowded around me. I did not recognize any of them. but in the dream, I knew their names. Someone shouted for ammunition. Another man screamed for his mother. An explosion shook the ground, and dirt rained down over us. My left arm was burning. When I looked down, blood poured through a hole in my uniform. I tried to call for help, but another explosion drowned out my voice. I woke on the floor beside my bed. My left shoulder felt as though it had been crushed. For several minutes, I could still smell the trench. Mud, blood, smoke. I did not sleep again that night. The next dream was different. I was running across an open field while gunfire snapped through the air. A man beside me fell face first into the grass. I kept running. Someone shouted that we had to go back for him. I turned and saw flames rising from a damaged vehicle. Then something struck my chest. I woke screaming. A dark bruise had appeared over my ribs. It faded by morning. The dreams began following me into the daytime. At work, I sometimes saw men standing near the edges of my vision. They wore uniforms from different periods. Some had helmets. Others wore torn coats or stained shirts. Their faces were thin and pale. Their eyes looked empty. Whenever I turned to face them, they vanished. The whispers started soon afterward. At first, I thought people in the office were talking about me. I would hear a voice near the printer. Liar. When I looked, no one was there. Another voice followed me into the restroom. Thief. Sometimes, as I walked home, a whisper moved beside my ear. Coward. The voices were weak and dry, like paper being rubbed together. But beneath that thin sound was a deep and terrible anger. The metals changed as well. The Purple Heart seemed darker than before. The campaign metals sometimes moved slightly, even when there was no breeze. The Bronze Star was the worst. It began humming loudly whenever I entered the room. Some nights I woke to find it shaking inside the mahogany case. Whenever I looked at it, I felt a wave of shame so powerful that I could hardly breathe. The feeling did not belong to me. It came with memories that were not mine. A burning village. A wounded young soldier calling for help. A man carrying another man through smoke, while bullets struck the walls around them. I understood then that the metal belonged to someone brave, someone who had risked his life for others, and I had worn his honor like a costume to impress a woman. He wanted it back. Julie and I continued seeing each other. The lie had worked better than I ever expected. She wanted to hear more about my service. She introduced me to her friends as a decorated veteran. Each time she said those words, I felt sick. I had to create more stories. I invented names for soldiers who had never existed. I described places I had never visited. I spoke about battles I had only seen in movies. Julie listened with respect. Sometimes she touched my hand and told me how brave I was. Every compliment felt like another weight added to my chest. I stopped sleeping. Whenever I closed my eyes, I returned to the trenches, burning vehicles, dark forests, and crowded field hospitals. I felt injuries that belonged to different men. A blade cutting into my side, shrapnel tearing through my leg, fire burning my hands, cold water filling my lungs. One night, I dreamed that I was lying alone in deep snow. My blood had frozen around me. I could hear footsteps approaching, but I knew help would not arrive in time. I woke with my body so cold that my teeth were chattering. The heater was running. My health quickly began to fail. I stopped eating because food tasted like metal and ash. My skin became pale and gray. Dark circles formed beneath my eyes. Coworkers asked whether I was sick. I blamed stress. Julie became worried. She suggested I speak to a doctor or therapist. I told her the old war memories had returned. Even then, I continued lying. Part of me wanted to confess, but I was terrified that she would leave. The rest of me no longer cared whether she stayed. I only wanted the pain to stop. The phantom wounds became constant. My shoulder burned throughout the day. My ribs ached. My feet felt cold and numb. Sometimes I felt pressure around my throat, as if a rope were tightening there. I began covering the metals with a cloth. That did not help. I moved the case into a closet. The humming continued through the walls. I put it in the trunk of my car. That night, I dreamed that a dozen dead soldiers stood around my bed. By morning, the case was back on the shelf in my living room. I have no memory of bringing it upstairs. I considered throwing the medals away, but every time I touched the case, the pain became unbearable. I thought about returning them to the pawn shop. When I called, the number had been disconnected. I went back to the building. The pawn shop was empty. A sign in the window said the property had been vacant for almost a year. I stood on the sidewalk in the rain, staring through the dusty glass. That was impossible. I had bought the medals there only weeks earlier. The laundromat owner next door told me no pawn shop had operated in that location for years. I did not know what to believe anymore. The final confrontation happened late one night. I was standing alone in my living room. The medals rested inside the mahogany case on the shelf. The glass vibrated softly. The humming had grown so loud that I could feel it in my teeth. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed deeper than normal. They began to move. At first, they stretched slowly across the walls. Then, they twisted into the shapes of men. One stood near the window. Another appeared beside the hallway. More gathered behind the sofa. The temperature dropped so quickly that frost formed along the inside of the windows. The whispers surrounded me. Liar, thief, coward, the words came from every direction. I covered my ears, but the voices continued inside my head. "I'm sorry," I shouted. The room went silent. Then a voice spoke from directly behind me. It was cold, clear, and filled with rage. "You think you can wear our sacrifice like a costume?" I turned. A man stood inches away. His uniform was torn and blackened. Part of his face was burned. A dark hole marked the left side of his chest. Behind him stood the others, men from different wars. Some were young, some were old. Some wore clean uniforms, while others were covered in mud and blood. All of them stared at me. A crushing force struck my chest. I flew backward and hit the floor. The air rushed from my lungs. An invisible weight pressed down on me. I could not stand or even roll onto my side. Cold hands pushed into my ribs. Fingers wrapped around my arms and shoulders. The phantom wounds opened all at once. My shoulder burned. My chest broke. My legs twisted with pain. I screamed until my throat became raw. The dead men moved closer. Their mouths opened. "You stole what was ours." "I didn't know," I gasped. "You knew enough. I'm sorry." The pressure increased. I truly believed they were going to kill me. Then, I looked toward the shelf. The metals shook violently inside the case. I understood what they wanted. With the last of my strength, I dragged myself across the floor. The invisible hands tried to hold me back. My fingers scraped against the carpet. Every movement sent pain through my body. I reached the shelf and pulled myself up. The moment I grabbed the case, the glass cracked. The room filled with a sound like dozens of people taking a sharp breath at the same time. I ran. I did not stop to put on a coat or shoes. I carried the medals down the stairs, across the parking lot, and into my car. The shadowy figures followed me to the building entrance, but did not come outside. I drove through the city with the case on the passenger seat. I knew I could not return the medals to the men who had earned them. I did not know their names or where they had been buried, but I could place the medals somewhere they would be respected. The local historical museum opened early that morning. I waited in the parking lot until a staff member unlocked the doors. Inside, I asked to speak with someone about donating military items. A few minutes later, an elderly woman came to meet me. She introduced herself as the museum curator. She had short gray hair, sharp eyes, and a calm voice. When she saw the case, her expression became serious. "These are beautiful," she said quietly. I told her another lie. I claimed I had found the medals among the belongings of a distant relative. I said I did not know much about their history, but believed they belonged in a museum. She examined each medal carefully. "We will research them," she said, "and we will display them with respect." The word respect almost broke me. I handed her the mahogany case. As soon as it left my hands, a soft sound moved through the room. It was like a long, tired sigh, a collective breath released after years of being held. The humming stopped. The pain in my shoulder disappeared. The pressure around my ribs vanished. For the first time in weeks, I felt warm. The curator looked up. "Did you hear that?" I stared at her. "Hear what?" She glanced around the room. Nothing. I must have imagined it. She carried the case away. I left the museum feeling lighter than I had in a long time. The haunting was over. But I still had one thing left to do. That evening, I went to Julie's apartment. My hands shook as I stood outside her door. My face was pale, my clothes hung loosely on my body, and I looked 10 years older than I had when we first met. When Julie opened the door, her eyes widened. "Where are the medals?" I gave them away. She stepped aside and let me enter. I sat on her sofa. Then I told her everything. I told her about the pawn shop, the old man, and the mahogany case. I admitted that I had never served in the military. I explained how I had invented every story. I told her the Purple Heart was not mine. The Bronze Star was not mine. The injuries, dead friends, missions, and battles were all lies. Then I told her about the nightmares, the voices, the phantom wounds, and the dead soldiers in my living room. I told her about the museum and the sound the medals made when I gave them away. Julie listened without interrupting. At first, her face showed confusion. Then, shock. Finally, disgust. When I finished, the room was silent. I expected her to shout. I expected her to slap me or call me a monster. She did neither. She only stared. Her face had gone pale. The admiration that once filled her eyes was gone. In its place was something colder. Not fear of the ghosts. Fear of me. "I don't know who you are," she said. Her voice was quiet. That made it hurt more. "Julie, I'm sorry. You lied to me from the beginning. I know. You used dead men's medals to make yourself look brave." I lowered my head. "Yes." She stood and opened the apartment door. For a moment, I remained sitting. I wanted to explain that I had only been lonely. I wanted to tell her that I was not a bad man, only a weak one. But every excuse sounded empty. I walked to the door. Julie stepped back so I could pass. She did not say goodbye. The door closed behind me. That was the last time I ever saw her. The haunting stopped after I donated the medals. The whispers never returned. The phantom wounds disappeared. I no longer see soldiers standing at the edges of rooms, and I have not dreamed of the trenches in years. But I am not truly free. I still remember every face. I remember the man with the burned cheek. I remember the soldier with the hole in his chest. I remember the rage in their voices. Most of all, I remember the shame. People have offered ordinary explanations for what happened. Some say the pain was caused by guilt. Others believe the nightmares came from stress and lack of sleep. A doctor once told me the bruises and physical sensations could have been psychosomatic. My mind expected punishment, so my body created it. Perhaps that explanation sounds reasonable. But guilt cannot return a wooden case from a locked car trunk to an apartment shelf. Stress cannot cause several dead men to stand in a room at once. And imagination cannot make another person hear a room full of spirits sigh with relief. The medals were real. The men were real. They had suffered, fought, and died. They had earned every piece of metal inside that case. I had tried to steal their courage because I was ashamed of my own ordinary life. I wanted to become somebody. For a short time, the medals gave me what I wanted. Julie admired me. People listened when I spoke. I finally had stories worth telling. But those stories were never mine. That was the lesson the dead taught me. A man cannot become a hero by wearing another man's honor. He only becomes a thief dressed in someone else's sacrifice. Story 5. My boyfriend had always been terrible at choosing nicknames for me. Some people use sweet names like Honey, Darling, or Beautiful. Not Mike. He called me whatever strange phrase entered his head at the time. For a while, I was Shrimp. Then, I became Hot Stuff. Once, for almost an entire week, he refused to call me anything except Tinder Toes. I never understood that one, and never explained it. Most of his nicknames disappeared after a few days. I learned to ignore them because arguing only encouraged him. The more annoyed I became, the longer he would keep using the name. Then, he invented the worst one yet. Tony Pizza. The first time he called me that, we were sitting in the kitchen eating breakfast. He had looked up from his phone, smiled, and said, "Could you pass me the sugar?" Tony Pizza? I stared at him. "Why did you call me Tony Pizza?" Mike shrugged as if the answer should have been obvious. "Why not Tony Pizza? That doesn't even make sense." Not everything has to make sense. I should have known better than to keep arguing, but the name was so stupid that I could not understand why he found it funny. "Where did you even get it?" "I don't know. It just came to me." He grinned while saying it, but there was something slightly different about his smile. At the time, I could not explain what bothered me. It seemed almost nervous, like he was waiting to see how I would react. I rolled my eyes and dropped the subject. At first, I tried to be a good sport about the nickname. It was strange, but Mike had called me worse things. I assumed he would become bored after a few days and move on. Instead, Tony Pizza remained. He called me that in the morning when I woke up. He used it in text messages. He shouted it across grocery stores and restaurants. He even introduced me to a delivery driver as Tony Pizza. Then our friends started using it too. "Hey, Tony Pizza is here." One of them would shout when I arrived. Others changed the pronunciation to make it more annoying. "Yo, Tony Pizza. Make room for Tony P. Someone order a Tony Pizza?" It drove me crazy, but I tried not to react. It was only a nickname. It could not hurt me unless I allowed it to. Sticks and stones could break bones. Names were only words. That was what I told myself. Then, the phone calls started. It happened on my day off. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through Netflix without finding anything worth watching, when my phone began to ring. The number was unfamiliar. I almost ignored it. Most unknown calls were telemarketers or recorded messages telling me that the warranty on a car I did not own was about to expire. For some reason, I answered. "Hello?" A woman spoke in a calm, professional voice. "May I speak with Tony?" I frowned. "Who?" There was a pause, followed by the sound of papers being moved. "Tony Pizza." "May I speak with Tony Pizza?" I closed my eyes and sighed. I immediately assumed one of my friends had arranged the call as a joke. Very funny. "Who is this?" "Is that you, Margot?" "No, ma'am. This is the National Debt Collection Service. We are attempting to collect an unpaid debt belonging to a Tony Pizza." The woman sounded completely serious. I sat up straighter. "Tony Pizza is not a real person. It's only a stupid nickname my boyfriend gave me. Well, real or not, Tony Pizza owes $15,000 in credit card debt. The account has been sent to our office for collection." My mouth suddenly felt dry. "How much did you say?" $15,000. The woman paused. "So, are you Tony Pizza?" "No, I just told you that isn't my name. But this is the phone number connected to the account. That has to be a mistake. The account also lists your home address." A cold feeling moved through me. I asked her to read the address. She gave me my apartment number, street, city, and postal code. Every detail was correct. I spent the next several minutes trying to explain that no one named Tony Pizza lived at my address. I told her that Mike had recently begun using the name as a joke, but that it had no legal meaning. The woman seemed less certain by the end of the call. She said the company would review its records, but she warned me that every piece of information they had pointed toward someone living at my address and using my phone number. Before hanging up, I promised that I would speak to Mike and ask whether he knew anything about it. I called him immediately. His phone went straight to voicemail. I tried again. Voicemail. That was when I began to wonder whether the nickname was more than a joke. What if Mike had opened credit cards under that ridiculous name and connected them to my personal information? Could someone even do that? I had no idea, but $15,000 was not a small mistake. Mike had also been distant lately. When we first met, he told me constantly how much he loved me. We had been together for nearly 2 years, and for most of that time, he had been affectionate and attentive. During the past month, something had changed. He stopped sitting close to me on the couch. He spent more time staring at his phone. When I tried to kiss him, he sometimes turned his face away as if he had not noticed me moving closer. Even when we slept in the same bed, he felt far away. I worried that he was preparing to leave me. I had experienced that feeling before. People always seemed to begin leaving long before they actually walked through the door. Unfortunately, I was usually the last person to notice. I called several of our mutual friends and asked whether they had seen Mike. No one had. When I explained the debt collection call, they laughed. "Classic Mike," they said. They assumed it was one of his jokes. I called Margot too, but she promised she knew nothing about it. After trying Mike several more times, I became angry. He was supposed to be working. He delivered pizzas for Domino's, and his shift should have started hours earlier. I decided to walk to the restaurant and confront him in person. With any luck, he would be waiting for an order when I arrived. I wanted him to explain the debt, the nickname, and why my contact information had been attached to an account belonging to a person who supposedly did not exist. I changed clothes, grabbed my phone and keys, and placed a small can of mace in my pocket. You could never be too careful. I lived in a large apartment building, and the manager's office was beside the main entrance. As I walked past it, Mr. Dubry stuck his head through the doorway. "There you are," he said. "I wanted to discuss the rent on the other unit." I stopped. "What other unit?" "The rent hasn't been paid for 2 months, and I'm beginning to lose patience. I only rent one apartment." Mr. Dubry looked confused. He returned to his desk and searched through a pile of papers. After a moment, he found the document he wanted. "Unit 402, he said. It was rented to A. He looked down at the page, then shook his head. "Tony Pizza? Seriously? My secretary must have approved this one." My stomach tightened. "What did you say?" "Unit 402 is registered under the name Tony Pizza. Your current apartment is listed as the primary address connected to it." He looked at me over the papers. "So either you rented it or your boyfriend did. I didn't rent another apartment." "Then perhaps you should speak with Mike. Can I see the paperwork?" He hesitated before turning the document around. The application listed Tony Pizza as the renter, but underneath it were my address and phone number. "How did anyone rent an apartment with a fake name?" I asked. Mr. Dubry sighed. "You would be surprised by what gets approved when people complete everything online. The security deposit was paid, and the first few months arrived on time." "Have you ever met the person who lives there?" He thought for a moment. "No, I assumed it was one of your boyfriend's friends. I've seen Mike going up that way before." My anger grew. Mike had rented a hidden apartment in our building under the stupid nickname he had given me. The unpaid debt suddenly seemed connected to something much larger. What was he doing? Was he stealing my information? Was he hiding money? Was he preparing to disappear and leave me responsible for everything? "I'm going to find him," I told Mr. Dubry. "I'll ask him what this is about, because I have never rented Unit 402. "Let me know what you discover," he said. "Someone will have to pay what is owed." I left the building in a furious state. My earlier fear that Mike planned to leave me was being replaced by anger. Breaking up with me would have been painful, but using my information to create debts and rent secret apartments was something else. He would answer my questions. I would not allow him to laugh this away as another joke. The Domino's restaurant was only a few blocks from our building. I walked quickly, replaying possible arguments in my head. By the time I reached the store, I was prepared to scream at him. The restaurant was quiet. A few empty pizza boxes were stacked near the counter, and the smell of cheese and garlic filled the air. Damien was standing behind the register. We had known each other since elementary school, though we had never been close. He wore his long hair in dreadlocks, and one of them bounced across his forehead as he looked up. His face brightened. "Hey, it's Tony Pizza." I had to stop myself from throwing my phone at him. "Save it, Damien. Where's Mike?" His smile disappeared. "Don't know." "What do you mean you don't know?" "He never came to work today." That was not like Mike. Whatever problems we had, he almost never missed work without calling. "Did he say anything yesterday?" "No," Damien scratched his head. "Someone did come here looking for you, though, for me." "Who?" "The cops." My anger immediately changed into fear. Police officers did not usually visit your workplace for no reason. "You must have passed them on the street," Damien continued. "They left a few minutes ago." "What did they want?" "They asked whether anyone had seen you. They said they were looking for someone named Tony Pizza, and you're the only person I know with that name. I felt like screaming. Tony Pizza. Tony Pizza. Tony fucking Pizza. The name had been a stupid joke that morning. Now it appeared everywhere I went. A debt collection company wanted Tony Pizza. My apartment manager wanted rent from Tony Pizza. The police were searching for Tony Pizza. It felt like I had stepped into a bad television episode where reality stopped following normal rules. You told them that isn't my real name, right? I asked. You explained that Mike made it up? Damien looked uncomfortable. I meant to. What does that mean? It's weird. What is? When they asked for your real name, I couldn't remember it. I stared at him. You've known me since elementary school. I know. I remember your face. I remember classes we had together. I remember the time you threw up during the school play. Thanks for bringing that up. But I couldn't remember your name. He rubbed the side of his head. I'm not sure whether I told them Tony Pizza was a nickname either. I gave them your address, though, yours and Mike's. They may be waiting there. I studied his face, searching for signs that this was part of the joke. Damien looked genuinely confused. His memory was not perfect, but there was no reason he should have forgotten my name. I left the restaurant and told him I would return home to speak with the police. My phone rang as I walked along the sidewalk. Another unknown number. This caller worked for a different collection company. They were searching for Tony Pizza over $12,000 in unpaid loans. I told them I was not Tony and hung up. My phone rang again before I could place it back in my pocket. This time, a parking garage employee informed me that a vehicle belonging to Pizza, Tony, would be towed if it was not collected before the end of the day. Now there was a car, too. The garage was only a few blocks from my apartment. I wanted to investigate, but the police were already waiting for me. I decided it would be safer to speak with them first and tell them everything. 2 police cars were parked outside my building when I returned. The officers noticed me immediately. One was a large man with a round stomach and a reddish face. The other appeared younger and more professional. They approached together. Are you Tony Pizza? The larger officer asked. I gave him an annoyed look. Do I look like someone named Tony Pizza? His expression hardened, but the other officer placed a hand in front of him. Sorry, the calmer man said. I'm Officer Page. This is Officer Gardner. We're looking for someone who may be connected to a serious crime. Do you have a moment to speak with us? I wanted to tell them about the calls in the apartment, so I agreed. We entered the lobby to avoid having the conversation on the sidewalk. Officer Page opened a small notebook. We received an anonymous tip this morning about a person who left the scene of a very serious crime. He paused, carefully choosing his words. There was no clear description of the suspect. However, a witness reported hearing someone call that person Tony Pizza the night before. I sighed. This is impossible. Tony Pizza is only a nickname my boyfriend started using. I was inside my apartment all night. Officer Gardner opened his mouth to say something, but Page stopped him. Can anyone confirm you were home? I thought about the previous evening. Mike had worked late. I had been alone until he returned at around 11. He came inside quietly, took a shower, and went straight to bed. Before leaving the living room, he kissed the top of my head. I love you, he had said. The words had felt strange. He had not told me he loved me for nearly 2 weeks. I had said it back because I wanted to believe everything was normal. Now that moment felt like another warning I had ignored. My boyfriend came home around 11, I told them. He can confirm that I was there, but I can't find him today. What is your boyfriend's name? Paige asked. Michael August. They wrote down his phone number, workplace, age, and physical description. Then they began asking questions about me. Where did I work? Did I own a car? Did I have access to firearms? Had I ever been arrested? Did I know anyone who might want to harm me? The questions continued until I finally became frustrated. What crime are you investigating? Paige exchanged a look with Gardner.